Hannibal turned his army north toward Rome itself, and the republic that had ruled Italy for 2 centuries had perhaps 2 weeks left to live. It was the days after August 216 BCE. On the plain of Cannae, his Carthaginian and allied troops had just done the unthinkable, closing a double envelopment around a Roman host and slaughtering somewhere between 50 and 70,000 men in a single afternoon. The consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus lay dead among them. The other consul, Gaius Terentius Varro, had fled to Venusia with the broken remnant. And in the silence after the killing, Hannibal's cavalry commander Maharbal pressed him, "Send the horse ahead, and in 5 days you will dine on the capital." In our history, Hannibal hesitated, and Maharbal answered that the gods had not given all gifts to one man. Hannibal knew how to win a victory, but not how to use one. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Here, Hannibal does not hesitate. Against the council of officers who urged him to spend the victory slowly, peeling away Rome's Italian allies city by city, he accepts Maharbal's argument. The objections were sound. His field army was small, built for maneuver, not for sieges. He had no siege train. Rome lay 400 kilometers away behind the spine of the Apennines. But the same boldness that had carried elephants over the Alps now overruled prudence. The columns formed, they marched toward the city, and what no one in that camp could yet see was how much would turn on a single decision made in the exhaustion of triumph. The road north was harder than any battlefield. Hannibal's army pushed up the peninsula through late summer, and the country itself fought him. Fortified Latin colonies sat astride every major route, garrisoned and walled, and he could not afford to stop and reduce a single one. Each siege he declined was a town left intact at his back, so he bypassed them, threading his columns through valleys and along ridgelines, taking what the land would give. The harvest had been gathered, but the stores were locked behind the very walls he was avoiding, and as the days lengthened, his foragers ranged farther for less. Speed was everything, and speed cost him. Men who had survived Cannae fell out on the mountain tracks. Horses went lame on stone. Yet the news of his coming outran the army itself, carried by refugees and panicked messengers. And that news did more damage than any catapult. Word reached the Campanian aristocracy, and Capua, one of the largest cities in all Italy, opened its gates to him as it had begun to do in the real war, calculating that the future now spoke Punic. A base, grain, and the legitimacy of a great city's defection followed in his wake. But Capua lay behind him now. Ahead was only the road, and at the end of it, the walls. In Rome, the city came apart. Women wailed in the streets and crowds pressed against the temple doors, and the Senate struggled to be heard over a population convinced the end had arrived. The religious terror was real and historical. The priests consulted the Sibylline books, and among the rites of expiation, the city carried out human burials in the Forum Boarium, 2 Greeks and 2 Gauls put alive into the earth to appease a divine anger that had drowned an army in its own blood. The disaster was read as the wrath of the gods, and the gods seemed very close. Then order returned, and it wore the face of Quintus Fabius Maximus. The old man who had counseled patience and delay now imposed both. He forbade the spreading of rumor, stationed men at the gates to turn back those who would flee, and set the city to work on the Servian walls. And he reached for the Republic's deepest reserve, its manpower. Rome enrolled boys too young for the legions and armed slaves with the promise of freedom, scraping fresh cohorts from a population that refused to break. The walls were old but strong, the circuit long, and the river guarded one flank. It would not be enough to win. It might be enough to wait. Hannibal came at last within sight of the city, and there the limits of his gamble stood revealed in stone. He invested Rome, his cavalry sweeping the countryside, cutting the roads, burning the villas of the senators within view of their owners on the ramparts. In the open field, he remained unbeaten and unbeatable. But the open field ended at the Servian wall, and against that wall his genius had nothing to say. He had no engines. His infantry, the instrument of Cannae, could maneuver brilliantly across a plain and do nothing against a fortified circuit it could not climb or batter. So the siege settled into a contest of endurance, and endurance favored the defender behind the wall and the granary. The Latin colonies he had bypassed now proved their worth, sitting on his supply lines, intact and hostile, while loyal central Italian allies funneled what they could toward the city. His own men, far from home, living off a stripped land, began to starve alongside those they besieged. He had reached Rome, he could not take it. And every week that the wall held, the question shifted away from the battlefield and toward a chamber across the sea, where men who had never seen Italy would decide whether his victory meant anything at all. For years, the men who ruled Carthage had given Hannibal little. The oligarchic Senate and its suffetes, the great commercial families weighing every expedition against the ledger, had let their finest general fight in Italy on a shoestring, reluctant to pour treasure into a war that enriched the Barcids more than the city. In the real history, that hesitation never broke, and it was the slow poison that killed the Carthaginian cause. Here, the sight of Rome itself under siege changes the arithmetic. A general at the gates of his enemy's capital is no longer a gamble. He is an investment that may yet pay. The Senate votes, it commits the reinforcements, and crucially, the siege specialists and engineers it had so long withheld, the men who knew how to bring down a wall. And it sends orders to Iberia, to Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, to break off the war against the Scipios and march his army and his siege capacity over the Alps to Italy. It was a fearful risk. It surrendered the Iberian Peninsula to gamble everything on Rome. But the prize was the end of the war in a single campaign. The decision Carthage had refused to make for years, it made now because for the first time the reward seemed certain, and so the siege that could not be won by the army before the walls would be decided by what was now marching toward them. When Hasdrubal's column finally descended into Italy, the siege changed character overnight. The engineers went to work. Towers rose against the Servian circuit, rams swung against gates that had held for months, and the defenders themselves, half-starved and stretched thin across too long a wall, could no longer be strong everywhere at once. The city had endured the army that beat it at Cannae. It could not endure that army equipped at last with the means to break stone. A section of wall came down. It is enough. With famine inside and a breach open, Fabius Maximus faced a choice between annihilation and terms, and the old realist chose survival over pride. The Senate negotiated. What Hannibal offered, and what Carthage instructed him to accept, was not the erasure of Rome, but its reduction, a peace that stripped the Republic of its empire rather than its existence. Rome would keep its walls, its gods, and its name. It would surrender its fleet, its alliances, its claim to lead Italy, and its place among the powers of the Mediterranean. The city that had meant to rule the world would live on as one Latin town among many. The killing of a nation is rarely a single blow. It is a signature. What truly fell at Rome was not the city but the system. For generations, Rome had been the keystone of a vast architecture of alliances, Latin colonies, Italian peoples, Greek cities of the south, bound to it by treaty, fear, and the certainty that Rome would always win. With Rome humbled and disarmed, the certainty was gone, and the architecture dissolved into its component stones. There was no longer a center to obey. So the communities of Italy did what communities do when the protector fails. They began to negotiate for themselves. Latin towns that had bled to stay loyal now bargained directly with Carthage for their standing. Etruscan cities, long since absorbed, reasserted their separateness. The Greek cities of the south looked to the sea and to the merchant powers that ruled it. Capua and the Campanian aristocracy, having backed the winner, claimed their reward. There was no single moment of collapse, no second great battle, only 1,000 quiet recalculations, as each city asked who could now compel it, and answered, no one. The Confederation that had been Rome's true weapon, more than any legion, simply ceased to mean anything. And into the vacuum where Roman power had stood, a different kind of order began to flow. There was no Latin legion left to organize the West, and so the West organized itself around what remained: ships, ports, and the families who owned them. The Mediterranean took its shape from Carthaginian sea power and the commercial dynasties that wielded it, a world of trading cities and negotiated alliances rather than one of marching roads and citizen armies. Carthage did not rule it as Rome would have ruled, by law and legion, and the steady extension of citizenship. It dominated it as Carthage always had, through harbors, contracts, and fleets, a network of interest held together by profit rather than conquest. The deepest change was not the map, but the model. In our history, Rome gave the West a particular idea of power, the public thing, the res publica, defended by the armed citizen, and expressed through law and the legion, an idea that would echo for 2,000 years. In this timeline, that idea is stillborn on the Servian Wall. The West that emerges is oligarchic and commercial, governed by senates of merchant families and the magistrates they appoint, measuring strength in cargo rather than cohorts. It is worth remembering that none of this was destined. Rome recovered in our world precisely because Hannibal did not march, because the Latin allies held, because Carthage hesitated, because a great city is harder to take than to defeat. Change one decision in the dust after Cannae, and the legion never becomes the language in which the West learns to speak of power. History does not turn on fate. It turns on the choices made by tired men in the hours after a victory, when they cannot yet see which road leads home.